So let's start looking at some temples. We'll start with the Temple of Hera I. And sometimes we'll have numbers associated with temples. That's because we have multiple temples to the same god in the same place. And this is a primary example of archaic Doric temple structure. From what you can see, those are Doric columns. We have that bulbous capital, we have no base, and you'll notice that those columns are quite wide. And as we look at it, many of these temples, what you're going to see is, I'll show you a picture of the temple, but then there will also be a floor plan. Each of the circles is a column, and this is a wall. And this is unique to archaic temples in that it has this central row of columns running down the center. Now, with most temples, what they'll do is have a central door, and you'll put a cult statue here. But in this case, because of this central line of columns, they can't do that. So instead of having two cult statues, well, it may have also had one awkwardly placed. And this may have been logical in supporting the central beam across the roof, even though it has certain disadvantages. Basically, this is one of the earliest attempts at monumental architecture that the Greeks are creating. So they're not sure of the strength of the stone or the lintel across the top. So what they're going to do is use more columns, and they're going to be much closer. And you'll notice the width of the column is almost the same as the width of the opening between them. So almost half of the exterior is made up of column. That's much more than we'll see later on. This also rules out a central doorway in order to enter the space. And finally, when you look at the columns, you'll notice that they're curved. They start out narrow at the top, and they curve outward, and then they do curve I'm exaggerating it in my drawing here, but they do curve slightly in at the bottom. This is called entasis, E-N-T-A-S-I-S. And the reason for it is, from a distance, it makes the columns look straighter. So it's a matter of looking at from a distance and seeing all of these columns together. It's affecting some of the optics that we get in our eyes. And it's something we'll get into a little bit more later. Now this brings us to the Temple of Artemis, and there's not much left of the Temple of Artemis. This is a Doric temple, once again, dedicated to Artemis. And this is one of the first temples to be lavishly decorated. The part we're looking at is the west pediment. So this would be above the temple. We would have the columns underneath here, and then the cella behind. And what we see are decorative reliefs that would have been on both the metopes and the pediments, although we're just looking at the pediment. And the shape of the pediment, of course, causes a substantial issue. We have a giant triangle. And that's not a great triangle, but you get the idea. So there's a few things we can do, and we'll see the Greeks use a few of these ideas. In this case, they put tiny little figures over here, and they put really big figures in the middle. And this creates a very awkward situation. In the center, we have a gorgon, G-O-R-G-O-N. This is a Medusa figure. There were actually 3 gorgons, Medusa being one of them. And she's smiling at us, a symbol of that archaic statuary. And she's in this odd pinwheel form. It's a very unusual form, but it takes up the appropriate amount of space around her. It fills that raised area that we have at the point of the triangle. And she's flanked by her 2 sons. Craesor, you don't have to write his name down, and his other son, or her other son, Pegasus. You can see the horse's butt right there. Pegasus is the winged horse. Now, that may seem a little bit odd, and I don't ask questions. I don't ask why a half-snake female woman form gives birth to a horse. I simply accept it. They're the Greeks. They come up with their own stories. These three are flanked by two feline forms, these lion forms that we see here and on the other side. Those are coming from the ancient Near East, and they're going to have the same symbolism, the idea of courage and bravery, of strength. And this is referring to the strength of the Greeks. In the corners, on the right side, we see Zeus slaying a giant. And on the other side, we see scenes from the Trojan War, specifically Achilles' son killing the Trojan king Priam. So we have a lot of things going on here. And this would have been read, we're reading it independent of the rest of the temple here, but this would have been read with the rest of the temple, all the metopes, the other pediment, the cult statues. And it all would have spoken to stories about the goddess Artemis in one way, shape, or form.